All right, good morning, everyone. Can I just ask you to all please turn off your cell phones because they are recording the session. All right, my name is Daniel Brewer. I'm the lead AI programmer at Digital Extremes, and I'm here to talk to you about Warframe. We kind of like to call it space ninjas with machine guns. So Warframe is a free-to-play online action shooter. It's multiplayer, it's co-op. The players take the role of the space ninjas called the Tenno, and they go into battle in these powered exoskeleton armor suits called Warframes. Players undertake various missions against different enemy factions such as the Grenier Marines, the Corpus robots, and the infested space zombies. The missions all take place in procedurally generated levels, which keeps the variety high and allows for repeat playthroughs. You level up your Warframe as you play, and you gain new weapons and new abilities and increase your power. The enemies also scale in difficulty too, and that keeps things interesting. Just last week, we've launched our open beta, and today, actually, we launch on Steam at some point today. So it's a rather exciting time for us. I'm going to briefly cover how we construct the procedural levels, and then go into the details of how we actually get our AI to deal with these procedural levels, because we can't rely on traditional level designer tricks. The levels themselves represent multiple different environments. We currently have the guild spaceships, we've got asteroid mining facilities, and planetary outposts. But all are constructed to the same kind of pattern. They all work exactly the same way underneath the hood. So the level designers, they make these blocks or chunks of the level. And then at runtime, we can connect these together to form the whole level that the players will play through. We start by randomly selecting one of the start blocks, and then we connect further blocks to the previous ones, connecting each portal to one of the previous portals and making sure that we don't overlap any of the existing geometry. Our blocks are categorized as a start block or a connector block, which is a short corridor or an elevator that links multiple areas together. We have intermediate blocks, which are our larger combat spaces. We have objective blocks and then exit blocks. So we generate the layout by following a set of rules to select from these different types of blocks and connect them all together. Once we've generated the block layout, we add doors to cover up the seams between the blocks, and then any portals that don't go anywhere, we just cap them off so that they're not looking out into empty space. Some of the levels can be quite linear, following a serial progression of rooms from the start through the objective to the exit, and others can be sprawling, branching affairs which require more exploration and backtracking. Now, there are some problems that we have to face. We don't know the ordering that these blocks will appear ahead of time. And we also don't know the orientation of the blocks. We can rotate these blocks to fit in with the existing geometry so they don't overlap. And so you might enter from a different doorway into a block. The blocks can also repeat multiple times through the level. And we don't want to have the same encounter kind of scripted each time you enter the same block. It would immediately be recognized and become boring. So we can't rely on the usual tricks that level designers use to control the pacing, place the spawn points for the enemies, and kind of script up our set piece encounters. So this is where we need to get creative with our AI. So we need a way for the AI system to reason about the space that the players are moving through and the potential routes through the environment that the players may take. For this, we created the Tactical Area Map. This TAC Area Map is a series of potential conflict areas or branch points and the corridors that connect these areas together. It's not as fine-grained as the nav mesh, and it's not as coarse as the high-level nav graph. It's somewhere in the middle. We create the attack area map automatically at build time for each of the blocks. We use a process similar to constructing a Voronoi diagram. We sample the nav mesh, measuring the distance to the nearest obstacles, and then we take all those sample points and we find the ridges of that distance map. And that kind of gives us our corridors through the level, the pathways. From this, we can then form our areas and our corridors for our map, and when we can annotate that by adding our spawn points and our cover locations for faster searches at runtime. When the level layout is generated at runtime, we can connect all these attack area maps together to form one big continuous map. How does this help us? Well, to start with, we can create a distance map of each of the areas to the objectives. We start off by finding the area that contains the objective and seeding that with a distance of 0. And then we flood fill out from there the distance to each successive block. And what this means is that at any point we can just use a simple lookup to find how far away we are from the objective. We can then also easily look up which direction we need to move in to reach that objective. All we have to do is follow the distance map downhill and we'll arrive at the objective. So we can use this to determine how far away the players are from the objective, whether they are heading towards it or away from it, whether a particular agent or a cover spot is between the players and the objective. We can use this to weight our cover selection to make sure our agents appear to take cover defending the objective from the players, and also find appropriate fallback points where they can fall back to choke points. When the players complete the objective, they have to then find their way to the exit. So we reseed the distance map, and with the exit of the level as the seed now, and spread our distance out from there, and so we can always use the distance map to find our way towards where the player should be heading. This is all very good and well, but we need to spawn the enemies in appropriate positions. As I said before, we can't rely on scripted kind of triggers to set up the spawns. And because our players can explore the environment, we need to make sure that we spawn the enemies ahead of where they're actually heading. So influence maps come to the rescue here. The influence map for each faction spreads out from the avatars through the attack area map. By analyzing not only the intensity of the influence, but also its derivative, we can work out the direction that the players are heading. So as the players move, ahead of them the influence will be rising up, and behind them it's going to be subsiding, decreasing down. If they're lingering in a particular area, it'll stabilize, the rates of change will stabilize. So we can create a filter to select spawns in areas that have a positive increasing player influence, and this way we will always spawn enemies ahead of where the players are actually heading. Now we can also use our distance map and work out if the players are heading away from the objective, we can spawn fewer enemies there, and if they're heading towards the objective, we can spawn more enemies ahead of them. And this way we can give them a subtle clue as to which direction to head. They'll be attracted towards conflict. So if there's less going away, they'll know, hang on, maybe I should head in the other direction towards more of the enemies. Now the players are ninjas. So they may try and sneak past our AI. They can also use wall running and zip lines to outmaneuver them. And since we keep spawning enemies ahead of where the players are going, we'd ultimately end up with a lot more agents alive than we really want to have at any point. So the attack area map comes to the rescue again. We use an active area set around the players. This is kind of a bubble that follows them through the level. As the players move and advance, areas ahead of them will become active, and the areas they leave will decay down and then deactivate. All agents that are in deactivated areas are paused so that they no longer contribute to our population cap and they no longer take up any computation time. If the players then backtrack, and some of the missions require players to kind of move back and forth through the level, those agents that were paused will become unpaused and reactivate again when the active area set moves to encompass them. And this just gives us a little bit of consistency to the level. If the players ran past a tough agent on one way through, when they come back, that same guy will still be there. So I've shown how the players move through the space and how we decide where to spawn the opposition, but we need to control the pacing. We need to give this kind of roller coaster thrill ride of an experience to the players during a mission. We don't want them to feel like they're just battling an infinite number of enemies in random rooms. So for that, we need to measure the intensity of the action that's going on around them. We want to have the players experience something like this graph. The intensity should build up through some small encounters, and then it should peak during a major encounter, and then it should decay down once they are kind of mopping up and finishing that encounter. And then we want some quiet moments where they can recollect themselves and prepare for the next onslaught. Now, the problem is, you need to be able to measure something before you can control it. So we tried a number of different ways of measuring the intensity of the action around the players. We tried looking at the number of shots fired at enemies, the number of the special powers that the players have being used, how many enemies are nearby, how many are attacking the players. All this proved too inconsistent to actually give us an accurate measurement. So in the end, like another popular game, we ended up using the normalized damage taken by the players and the number of enemies nearby them that were killed. We had to normalize the damage taken because our players can level up and they can gain more health and shields and deal out more damage, and our NPCs also level up and they have become tougher and deal out more damage. So we need to have some way of measuring this, and using absolute values would have just been a nightmare to balance. So as the players are progressing through the level, we start off in the spawn stage. We will continue to spawn enemies up until the current population cap. The cap is based on the alertness level of the ship, which types of areas the players are moving through, and also whether they're heading towards or away from the objective. We want to have more enemies in the larger combat spaces on the route towards the objective, and we want to have fewer enemies in the corridors heading away from the objective. So once the intensity maxes out, they'll be taking damage from the encounters, and the intensity will eventually max out. We say that it is peaked. We have a peak of intensity. At this point, we continue our spawning process to sustain that intensity for the encounter for a short period of time. And then we stop our spawning, and we prevent any more agents spawning. That allows the players to then finish up any who are left around, and at that point, the intensity will decay down. Once it drops down to 0, and then the players move out of that area, we start the spawning process again, and they'll encounter more enemies in advance and continue the process. So we also want to give the impression that the players are moving through a ship or facility and that they can clear certain areas along the way. And they're not just fighting in infinite waves of enemies. So for this, when the intensity peaks, we mark the active areas as exhausted. We no longer allow enemies to spawn in those areas. At certain points, because we have to allow backtracking, we can clear that and allow them to spawn everywhere again. And this can represent new reinforcements coming to bolster the defenses as the players are making their way towards the exit. But then as the players progress through, they'll have more encounters, they can clear certain areas and progress towards the exit. Now this continuous dynamic spawning works really well most of the time, but in some missions, our exterminate missions in particular, we can't really rely on it. In these missions, the players need to kill a particular number of enemies before they reach the exit, and so we need to make sure that we spawn that required number of enemies along the way. So using our distance map and our attack area graph, we know at what point how far the players are from the objective. And so we can create a graph that maps distance to the objective versus the total population spawned. As the players move, we can look up how many enemies that need to be spawned at that point during the level. We can vary this graph, the slope of this graph, to adjust the pacing. We can start off with a gradual slope, and then we can increase it to give a concentration of enemies for the players to fight through, and then we can smooth it down again to give them a rest period, and so on. So using this, we can vary the pacing through the level, give them something interesting to fight, and ensure that by the time they reach the end of the level, the required number of enemies will have spawned, so they won't have to go looking for more and then running through empty rooms. And using the graph, it doesn't matter what the level layout is or how big the level is. We know that we're always going to spawn the required number before they reach the end. And that wraps up my part of the talk. Procedural levels are really awesome for the variety that they provide and the ability to play through missions multiple times and keep it interesting. But they do pose their own problems for the AI. And I hope some of the issues that I've covered have been interesting and thought-provoking, and I hope to see some more dynamic and procedural AI in the future.
Hi, I'm Alex Cheng from Firaxis Games. I'm here to talk about the AI on XCOM Enemy Unknown. So in case you're unfamiliar with the game, XCOM is a turn-based strategy. It is actually a reimagining of the original classic XCOM UFO Defense from 1994. In our game, like the original, you play the commander of an organization whose mission it is to save the world from a hostile alien invasion. So along the theme of the challenges faced, as a whole, our challenge was to make a modern update to the original classic. And for the AI, that meant bringing back as many of the original aliens as we could, and also creating distinct behaviors for each alien type. So along the lines of our game, the decisions that were made along these lines were the ability selection and the movement destination selection. So as a brief overview of the game, when you start a tactical mission, you select your squad from the headquarters. Here I selected a squad of elite AI gurus. And so your squad is transported to the site of some alien activity. And generally, the mission goal is to seek and destroy all the aliens on the map. So unlike the original, we did away with the units, the time unit system, and we put in place a 2-action system instead. And the way this worked, you can generally do a move and an attack with the one contingency that if you use a non-move ability, that's going to end your turn automatically. So along those lines, for the AI, we wanted to prioritize movement more heavily as the first action taken. So the way we did this, we used a utility-based system, and it's a simple system. All the abilities that are available to the unit are enumerated and scored, and we scored each ability based on an offensive score, a defensive score, and an intangible score, which was kind of a catch-all for any additional values I wanted to inject into that ability. So for each alien character, each ability was weighted, and we pick randomly from this list of abilities. It's a weighted random, so any abilities that have a higher utility value will generally be picked more often than the others. And so we also had a contingency that we wanted only one score per ability type. That way, in case there's an alien that's got multiple targets, we didn't want to spam the selection of abilities with the one action. And so we just took generally the highest hit chance ability for the shot ability, and that went into the list. of abilities to select from. And we generally weighted abilities that were unique to each character heavier than generic abilities that everybody has. So here's a screenshot of some debug spam. This is actually the ability selection that's displayed on screen. And it lists a breakdown of the scores and the random selections for all the available abilities. So generally, movement is heavily weighted as the initial move, and it's generally deprioritized as the second option. So the first guy that acted here is actually the mutant here on the left. And he ended up doing a move followed by a blood call action. And blood call is an ability that's unique to mutants. And it basically gives a buff to all the surrounding mutants within range. So he was heavily weighted to select that, while the mutants that moved after him, the utility value for that ability went down to 0 because basically blood call doesn't stack, so there was no use for that to be reused for anybody else. So the other guys generally did a move followed by an attack. So once they decide to do a move, the next important decision to make is, where do I go? And that we also used a utility-based system for that as well. This actually goes over the basic behaviors, movement behaviors that are found for all the aliens in the game. So actually, the movement decision is made, for the most part, independently of the ability selection. So that means, in some cases, we went through and did the destination search and found that the best destination is actually where the unit already is. When that happens, we basically invalidate movement as an ability, and we kick it back up to the ability selection. So let's talk about the first types of aliens, the ones that take cover, and that's a good number of them. So in our game, we have a cover system where you can be in full cover, you can be in half cover, or you can not be in cover at all, obviously. Full cover would be like standing up against the wall versus half cover, crouching down next to a car or something. So for aliens that use cover, we always want to pick the best cover location, and that's going to be subjective. And so we use the utility system again for this. And this score for the location is broken up into a bunch of these factors. First, we have a distance value, and that's going to decrease as you get further away from the nearest enemy. And that would correspond to a decrease in the aim accuracy and the hit chance. We have a flanking value, and that just increases the value of a location when it is flanking one or more units. Similarly, we have an angle score, and this value increases as you get closer to a flanking location. This kind of pushes the aliens towards flanking when they can't actually reach the flanking range. We have a cover bonus score. As you would imagine, a full cover location would give a higher bonus. And if it's not in cover at all, it's going to give a negative utility value. And we also have a visibility score. So this would peak when there's exactly one enemy visible at a particular location. And it would drop down as you get to a point that is visible to more enemies, just so that a unit would be less vulnerable at any particular location. And it would be negative. It's a negative score when it is actually visible to no enemies. Obviously, you don't want to move where you can't shoot anybody. There's also a proximity score, and this is put in place to inhibit clustering. You basically don't want to move all your aliens in one place, and they would be susceptible to getting grenaded and all being taken out at once. And now we also have a character-specific value here, And this is generally used for any unique abilities for any particular alien character. So for like the example with the Muton, with the blood call, any locations that are within range of any other Mutons that haven't already been buffed with that ability would get a bonus. So basically all these factors are weighted per alien character, and they are added together. And the list of all these locations are sorted in order of highest score to lowest. And then we generally just take the top value, at least the top one that passes any movement criterion that we have. So here's an example. We have a soldier in the back of the train here. He's currently in cover against this Muton. The Muton's deciding where to go. So we have our visualization of the cover point locations, the scoring. So obviously, the more green the sphere is here, the higher the score. The more red it is, the lower the score. So all the bright green points here are basically flanking the soldier here. They're at a good distance. The best location is in high cover and between those windows there. And it's flanking the unit, and it's a good short distance away, so low or no aim penalty there. So there are also units in our game that don't take cover at all, such as melee units. These guys are pretty simple to implement. Really, they just pick a point that is in melee range of one of these soldiers, probably the nearest soldier to them, and they just run directly to them. And we had similar movement for the mind-controlled units in the game. So in our game, we have certain aliens that have these psionic abilities, one being mind control, and that is an ability that lets you basically take control of one of these soldiers, and it becomes an AI-controlled unit for a couple turns. And these guys were fun because these guys didn't care about cover. We just had them run right up to their teammates, their former teammates, and we'd try to use them as suicide bombers whenever possible, just have them drop a grenade down at their feet, or just have them take a point-blank shot at somebody and see how they react. We also had flight units in our game. These guys don't care about cover either. So the trick with these guys was how to pick a flight destination. And it was easier for the cover locations because we could just poll for all the cover locations that were in movement range. So we needed to trim down the search space for these guys, and we ended up actually just using the cover locations anyway. And we just bumped the z-value up to a flight height and used the same utility system for these. And then we also have some extra units that didn't really fit into any of the other categories. Call them elite units. These are generally high HP units, high armor, that don't care about cover. We have the Sectopod, and they generally just pick a point that is in a good range, that's highly visible to all the soldiers, because these guys actually are able to take multiple shots in one turn. And they also had a big AoE attack, cluster bomb attack. So these guys like to be as visible to other aliens or other enemies as possible. Ethereals in the game, they have their bodyguards, the elite Mutons. So these guys generally stay close to the Mutons and stay kind of far away from the action. They try to just pick off one guy to mind control or use one of their other psionic abilities on. So this is pretty much all of the movement in our game. So to recap, our challenge was to create all these distinct behaviors, and that boiled down to their decisions of movement and what ability to select. So we were able to use our utility curves to come up with some good decisions based on the relevant factors, and we were also able to weight each of these factors uniquely for each alien character type to give us the differentiation and distinct behaviors that we're looking for. So in the end, we ended up with about 17 AI-controlled behaviors. So this worked out pretty well for us. And I just have to say that's XCOM, baby. Thanks for your time.
I get to stand on a box because I'm way shorter than the other guys. Alrighty. So 10 years ago, the Assassin's Creed team started working on what would become the staple and core pillar of the franchise, the free running and navigation systems. 4 games and 40 million copies later, the technology behind these features really hadn't been changed too much. So for AC3, we were crazy enough to say, hey, let's change it all. So today I'm going to walk you through some of the changes we decided to make to help refresh the look and feel of the game. So obviously saying something that's simple, like refresh the core pillars of your game, is pretty damn challenging. So for us, we really wanted to focus on 4 main areas: the ground navigation, the free running, the climbing, and to introduce a new system called the tree running. Although for us, the biggest challenge, especially for a huge brand like Assassin's Creed, was to try and change everything, yet at the same time to change nothing. What that meant was we couldn't change the way the game was played, or the fans actually would have killed us if we did that. So we really had to keep the core of the game familiar. What we really did want to do was to lift the experience for the player by changing the second-to-second feeling. And we also wanted to try out some cool new tech along the way that we'll be looking at today. So we'll first start off with the ground navigation system. So the way the main character moves and connects with the environment is something that we've been pushing since Assassin's Creed 1. Animation is and will always be a huge part of the franchise for us. So for us on AC3, we decided to heavily invest on procedural animation research. We knew right from the beginning that a big part of the game would happen in the frontier, in the forests. So for those who've seen it, we were originally inspired by the running through jungle scenes in the movie Apocalypto. This video here was actually our original animation intention video that we did 3 years ago. It showed the general concept of running through a forest and having the character's steps and body movement really react to the environment around him. We knew to actually be able to achieve something like that in the game meant that we would have a lot of challenges. First, having a fully realized forest meant that we would have lots of rock surfaces, slopes, and uneven terrain. Now, we had been working with human IK since AC1, but like most games, we had generally flat ground surfaces. So the new forest specs for us was going to be the main challenge. We knew that a purely animation approach wouldn't be enough, especially since we needed to support not only the ground navigation, but to support fight, assassinations, and all of our other behaviors on these uneven surfaces. So this was really one of the main reasons why we decided to invest so much in procedural animation. So this before and after chart helps to see why the frontier maps couldn't be supported, or at least just wouldn't look good, if we used our previous system. I remember on the previous Assassins, we actually had to tell our level designers to try and avoid having ground inclinations with over 30 degrees, because although we technically supported it with the IK, it actually looked really bad. So this time around, we wanted to bridge the gaps. We wanted to support any ground inclination and to have good looking and smooth transitions in between. So what we wanted to do was to tell our level designers this time around for AC3, do what you want, go crazy with your LD setups. So here in this video, we see the ground navigation smoothly transition up to 45 degrees. We put in a new slope animation layer that we actually blend with so that the 0 to 45 degree looks good this time. Once we pass the 45-degree mark, we transition to either what we call our new scrambling or sliding behavior. And we use human IK throughout the process to make sure that the foot actually connects. Once we had the setup to support any ground inclination, we decided to invest a lot of time in researching how the same could work with any ground obstacles, so any ground debris that would be on the ground. We wanted to have the character to be able to walk, run, and have his foot and body properly connect with whatever object was below him. So in the forest, there would be lots of rocks, logs, any objects that the level designers would place. This is where Simon Clavet, who's actually in the audience right now, right over there, he's our procedural animation guru, and he really worked his magic with us on AC3. He worked on a technology that we call the predictive foot placement. So in this video, we see a few of the different foot placement approaches that we've worked on over the past 3 years. Each example uses a different method. We also had to always keep in mind coming up with a compromise between quality and performance. So hello, next gen, once we have you, hopefully we don't have to spend as much time on optimizations. But definitely when it came down to analyzing the environment, we had to work a lot on optimizations. So how it worked in the end is, based on the animation and the speed of the character, we are able to find where the foot is going to step in advance. Then, by analyzing the environment through physics casts and ray casts, we find the highest point that we actually need to step over. With that information, we're able to have the IK solver position the foot on the detected obstacle, and then we update the pelvis in function to the height of our 2 feet during the foot placement update. So finally, for a touch in more quality, we decided to work on something that's called French strafing. This was purely to change the look of how the main character navigated, and to do something that we don't typically see in video games. So thanks to a mix of foot planting and animation, we tried to achieve something very different that, in my opinion, and I hope you guys agree, is pretty freaking cool. So in this video, we see our before version is what you would typically see more often in a video game. Rotation on the character based on the direction intention, and usually there's some damping on the rotation, but it still comes down to moving straight and rotating the character. Our intention video shows something completely different. We really wanted to achieve something that was more natural, where the character keeps its facing direction, and we incorporate strafing for the rotations. So the end result is really a mix of all the text developed and a bunch of new animations as well. So how does it all work? Well, when we change directions, we move the foot procedurally, either interior or exterior, depending on the step that we are at, using the predictive foot placement tech. Also, when we start to move in a direction, we never rotate the player right away. We start off by strafing the player in the desired direction, and then we activate the rotation. So that way, if you are moving your stick in a certain threshold, we're really just strafing the player back and forth and moving him forward without rotations. So what did we learn from all this? Well, we spent almost 3 years actually researching all the procedural animation work. We didn't actually see much of this in-game until the final 8 months or so before we shipped, and then at that point it was just all about optimizations. One thing that was cool was that we did get all of this tech to work as well for the NPCs in the game. However, we did have a more limited number of raycasts that we use with the NPCs. So depending on the number of NPCs that were on screen using the tech, the quality differed. But still, we were happy that we were able to get it to work for the NPCs. There were some things we didn't have time to really develop, but in the end, the result of what we achieved was something that the whole team was really proud of, nonetheless. So for us, the ground navigation was still a huge success for us. So on to what we did for free running. In the beginning, we didn't expect to change too much for the free running system, But as the game progressed, we realized that the style for the free running reminded us too much of Ezio, the main character from the previous AC2 to AC Revelations games. And it didn't really fit with the new style that we had for our character Connor in AC3. It was around that time that we decided as a team that we actually wanted to change every single animation in the game so that it would reflect the new style for Connor. This ended up being a huge job for the animators, and on the programming side, we did some simple changes so that we could support new variety and create new free-running opportunities. So this graph here basically shows the way things worked before, the before for Ezio. Basically, our whole jump system was just a blended animation system. So you would figure out where is it that I want to jump, figure out your quadrant, take your animations, and blend everything together. Long story short, we decided to make some simple changes that would highlight new jump moves in AC3, especially those that we would be seeing much more often now in the Frontier. What we kept that actually blended together were all of our short jumps. These were very time sensitive, so we didn't want to change the way the system worked. We just really wanted to refresh the animations for those. However, we wanted to separate all the long jumps so that these ones would end up being more one-offs, and then the animators could focus on creating new varieties and different options for those one-off jump animations. So here in this video, we see some of these one-off jump animations. The reason I'm showing this is we wouldn't have been able to achieve a style with these animations if the animators had to actually worry how is it going to blend with the other jump animations. So it's really a reason why we decided to separate them for the jump system. And that running through forest video shows a little bit of how it was used in the Frontier. And well, we wanted to make it work for the animals as well.
Oh, thank you, Alicia. So now I'm going to talk about the climbing system, which most of the animals actually don't do very well. So as you all know, the climb system is really a staple of the Assassin's Creed franchise since the very start. So we decided to give it a good facelift. So for inspiration, we looked at some very famous speed climbers like Dan Osman over here, and we actually saw that those guys can really climb like rock faces at some ridiculous speeds. Like, if I told you that somebody can climb a 400 feet tall cliff in just over 4 minutes, you would probably never believe me. Well, this guy does it. So if he can do it, the assassin surely can too. So this really inspired us to go over and make things smoother and faster than ever before. So the first thing we attacked is the input system. So before, we only supported a vertical or horizontal way of moving along the ledges. But now we really support a 360-degree range of motion. So this really allows the player to go wherever he wants in a much more precise manner. Then the next thing that we did was attack the fluidity. So what we really wanted to focus on here is preserving the character's momentum while he transitions from one move to the other. So, for example, previously, if we take a normal jump animation, we would just play the jump animation fully, then play the settle animation before being able to move again. Now what we do is we play the same jump animation, but when we reach the end, we analyze all that the environment that will be near the player, and also we look at his input. And depending on those two factors, we will play a special link-up animation to whatever move is coming next, be it a jump or just a movement cycle. So this was actually very costly in terms of animations to do, but the result is a much more fluid system. So here's a concrete example. Here you would see that the character is actually shimmying along the ledge, and when he reaches the end, he jumps, he swings, and he lands again in one fluid fashion. But these are all very small cut-up animations that are mashed up together depending on contextual environment detection. Another thing that we really had to improve is the range of the character, because now, in previous games, most of the building surfaces were kind of flat. But now, since we were going for much more organic environments and rock faces, so we had to make sure that the character was actually to reach much further and deform in a more solid manner. Next. So we also added a new move that we call the crack climbing. This is in direct reference of the Dan Osman video that you saw earlier, where the character actually grabs the side of the rocks instead of the usual horizontal anchors. So since we had a lot of rock faces in our game, this was actually very helpful, as well as a difference in visual style compared to the normal climbing. Another major part of the work was going from a static world to a fully dynamic world. We really wanted to support like moving stuff on the building facades and unstable rock formations and moving window sills and falling flower pots and all those kinds of things. But we also had the naval battles. You know, we have ships in our game, so there are basically gigantic moving platforms. So we really had to step up on this system. So we did a bunch of things to make this work, such as we introduced a bunch of different procedural modifiers on the character. So we would always adjust the body position depending if there's a ceiling coming near or if his head like sticks out over the building so he doesn't get seen by the guards, stuff like that. We also did the same thing for the legs. But the legs actually represent a much harder challenge because they define the support that the assassin lies on. So going from a position where he has his feet on the wall to just hanging while moving and vice versa is actually something quite tricky to get looking good. Here you see an example where instead of doing one canned animation, we actually follow the moving anchor and we always adjust the body position to make sure that we can move on individual moving anchors. So it's a truly dynamic world. So here's the full system in action. This windmill was our favorite test case because it represents all of the challenge combined into one object. And the actual difficulty here is that the anchors are always rotating, so that they can become invalid if they're angled too much. So we always have to compensate and do the detection all the time to make sure that we adjust. We also applied all of those dynamic modifications to all the rest of the behaviors so that we can really have a true dynamic world and the level designers can do pretty much what they want. So as a final recap, although the system really works well, it wasn't showcased as much as we would like because actually we didn't get to have many moving stuff on the building facades, mostly for memory and production constraints. But with the follow-through and the momentum preservation that we added and the new moves, the climb really feels much more solid and much more fluid than before. So we're pretty proud of that. And last but not least, we had to adapt all of our navigation systems to really support a fully realized forest. So as you're probably all aware of, a forest in video games is usually the thing that ends up with like invisible walls everywhere just to like avoid all of the problems and headaches. But since our biggest map in the game was the frontier, which was almost completely covered in forest, well, we had to tackle this challenge. So when we thought about it, we had a few clear goals in mind. That's right. We had a few clear goals in mind that we did not want the assassin to climb like the trees like a koala from a purely visual point of view. And we did not want him to swing on lines like Tarzan. That's really something we wanted to avoid. And also from a level design perspective, we really wanted the trees to act as elevators to bring you upstairs in the canopy or the treetops as fast as possible so that you can then be a predator and hunt down the guards or the animals with all of your tools. So here's the kind of the design breakdown of the typical setups that we have for the trees. We have obviously the unclimbable tree, which is more of a filler, and the artists need that. The middle tree is covered with standard climbing anchors, so it uses a normal climb system, and it has horizontal branches. So this type of tree is slowish to climb up, but once you're upstairs, moving horizontal along the treetops is actually very fast. And the other type of tree is what we call the V-shaped tree. So this one is the actual fast elevator, which I will demonstrate later. So this one is very fast to go up, and it also allows for jumping navigations from V-shape to V-shape on the top section. And on the right side, that's the top view of the middle tree to show that we had to also to solve the problem of navigating fast horizontally when you're upstairs in the treetops while going around the tree trunks. So here's our V-shaped system in action. We had to support all sorts of different V-shape configurations, and the artists and the level designers really can do pretty much what they want in terms of V-shape configuration. Here you see that the character is popping, but the tree is not actually supposed to deform in the actual game. This is just to show the system in actions. Like I said before, the trees were supposed to act as elevators, so the player can get fast in the treetop. So we devised a few kick jump moves to really propel you from V-shape to V-shape. So this is actually much faster than a standard climbing sequence, and it's also a welcome visual change. And it's all integrated in the climbing system. So that way the player can go up in the trees and hunt down his targets. The last thing one of the big challenge we had to creating this V-shaped system was actually making sure that the orientation and the distance of the trees did not matter, and we can support everything. So the LDs could be free of placing them anywhere. So we really have a bunch of ejection and reception animations that link up with the normal free-running systems. And we use some procedural modifications to make sure that the link up in and out is fluid, to preserve, once again, the momentum. The last thing we had to solve was actually be able to navigate in the treetops as fast as possible. So we devised a system that we call the trunk around, which is basically a bunch of animations that circle the trees, circle the tree trunks, and they link to the free running and or the climbing. So the level designers can really do a mishmash of free running, jumping on the trees, putting a climbing object, and create a cool free running sequence. So quick recap, the tree system was actually very successful because it really allowed the artist to make an organic forest, and it really complements very well the free running and the climbing because everything is fully integrated. And I will now let Alicia have the final words, since he doesn't suffer from my horrible French accent.
Merci, Richard. So to recap, when we started AC3, again, the intention was to redo everything but change nothing. We really wanted to focus on refreshing the second-to-second feeling, but not break the experience for the players who knew our system so well. As you can imagine, with a big project like this, do we wish we had more time? Obviously, like a couple weeks, a couple months, anything would have been great, but I think every game dev in here will agree, you always wish you had more time. But in the end, we're still really happy with what we were able to accomplish. It's great to be here today because some of the tech we developed, like Richard said, isn't really shown off a lot in the game, so it's good to come and show you guys what we did work on and expose that to everyone here. So we hope you guys enjoyed what you saw today. If anyone has questions, implementation details that we didn't go into, we'll be around all week. So thank you.
What do you say, folks? Is that kind of getting it off to a decent start? If I wasn't so old, I'd go out and try to run through trees right now. But Anyway, we do actually have about 2 or 3 minutes. There are microphones in all 3 of the aisles. If we could take maybe one question for any of the speakers. Yes, oh, thank God. That was an awkward silence.
Yeah, I figured I'd save you guys. This is a question for the Warframe guys. Did you ever think about, so it seems really similar to some of the stuff that Valve has been doing. Did you explore at all the concept of spawning in groups of enemies that were not part of your pacing, that like hunted the players down, or did that not come up at all?
We looked at a number of different ways of spawning the enemies, but unlike Valve with Left 4 Dead, we don't really have that many kind of unique mini-boss type enemies that we can just drop in all over the place. We wanted to be able to use our enemies throughout the level, almost in any room, pretty much. We do have a couple of boss fights that we have in very specific missions that you have to go and assassinate specific bosses, but for the most part, the enemies needed to be able to operate almost anywhere. So we felt we've just got a random selection. We weight which enemies that we want to spawn based on how difficult they are and how populous we want them to be. And we just use that. We will be further experimenting with some other forms of like spawning in groups of guys that work together. And we're always continuing to modify and improve the game as we go.
For those bosses, did you tie that to like the objective block type, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they only spawned in the assassinate objective block, and that would be the objective for your mission.
Thank you very much.
With the next generation hardware being released soon, do you guys think that as games get more difficult to program, will it make your job more difficult, or are the tools also progressing at a rate comparable?
Anybody?
Well, like you always have to keep developing your tools. They always help you make the games better and quicker and faster, no matter what the hardware you're looking at. The thing that we're going to have to deal with now is we're going to have a lot more memory, first of all, to have to fill up with things. And obviously the artists are going to take the lion's share of that with all their textures. But it also allows us to have a lot more animations. I mean, you look at Assassin's Creed, they have hundreds of animations. And you can also then start to use a lot of that memory for other AI techniques that you wouldn't be able to use, like a lot of the higher detailed nav meshes and influence maps and stuff like that, which we couldn't necessarily use before.
Okay, thanks.
One more short one.
All right. For Assassin's Creed, it seems like you guys are always just like constantly developing like new cool things for all the designers to use and stuff. At what point do you like let that go for the game? You're like, hey, we made this cool tool. It's ready. You can use it. I mean, did that happen? At what point?
Well, this actually is never a done deal. We're constantly like adding some small things, and to the bane of some of the level designers in here, we're really like trying to push the mark. So up until the very end, except for the core navigation stuff, which obviously needs to be like done sooner. But we're constantly adding some small bits and details. So a typical thing, you would expect that the core navigation stuff is like stable at least like a good 8 months before the big chunk of the production really kicks in. But that's not quite always what happens. That's what happens with ambition.
All right, thanks.
All right, thanks, guys. Please help me thank Daniel and Alex and Alicia and Richard. Fantastic information. All right, 15-minute break on this one.